Look, I'm just gonna come right out and say it. Godzilla King of the Monsters was pure sex. And I know the phrase might come off as odd to some of you, but for me, that movie was the pinnacle of Godzilla films in the modern age. Sure, nothing will ever truly compare to Godzilla 1984 or Godzilla 1954 for that fact, but let's face it, anything, and I mean anything, is better than Godzilla 1998. When it comes to the Monsterverse, it's one that so far has proven itself to be a pretty big crowd pleaser, but one that isn't always the most profitable. I actually chalk this up to the fact that Warner Brothers simply cannot market a franchise very well, which makes no sense when you think about it because the whole concept of the series is big scary monsters beating the ever-loving shit out of each other. Who can't get behind that concept? Well, sadly, a bunch of people originally, but that does actually seem to be changing, at least with Godzilla vs. Kong. I mean, here we are towards the end of a global pandemic that has killed over 2 million people, and this ape versus lizard flick is actually doing gangbusters in China, and a lot of people in the States have flocked to their recently opened movie theaters to check it out. Who knew that Godzilla vs. Kong, a movie that 2 years ago didn't even really seem like something anyone was really interested in, could be the savior of cinema, or at the very least a shot of adrenaline to the chest that it desperately effing needs. While I might be hesitant to take myself back to theaters because I haven't been vaccinated yet, you can bet your ass that I'm dreaming of it. But for right now, my 55-inch Samsung 4K will have to suffice, and I'm okay with that. But I will be honest with you. If one movie could get me to go back to theaters now, it would be Godzilla vs. Kong. And let me tell you why. This is one of those movies that I distinctly remember talking about back in May 2014. During an intermission at the drive-in, I was chatting with a coworker about the deal between Legendary Pictures and Warner Brothers coming to an end. We were discussing which studio Legendary would team up with next, and since Gareth Edwards' Godzilla was just in theaters, it got me thinking about how Universal would be the best choice. And then I just blurted it out. I yelled, "They could do Godzilla vs. Kong!" Hell, it only made sense to me in that moment in time. Legendary had the rights to Godzilla, King Kong is Universal's answer to the American kaiju, long before Cloverfield, that is. Plus, there's the old 1960s movie that already set the precedent, and this kind of team-up just felt like it had to happen at some point in time. This grand proclamation of mine was one that I made in the moment, and afterwards I didn't think much about it until San Diego Comic-Con a couple months later, when it was announced that Legendary had partnered with Universal and they were going to do a series of Monsterverse films, with the next one being about King Kong. By the way, I hate to admit this, but after 4 years, I finally saw Kong Skull Island earlier this afternoon, and I wanted to see it before watching Godzilla vs. Kong, and I'm now legitimately kicking myself in the ass because I didn't see this in theaters 4 years ago. What can I say? It came at a time when I was getting ready to buy my first house, and my girlfriend had just gotten pregnant with our first daughter. I didn't have a lot of time to slip away, and this is one that I didn't want to see alone. Which is funny, because today I sat in bed while my kids napped and I watched a giant gorilla beat the crap out of a bunch of Vietnam veterans and a giant squid. My point here is that it isn't bad to watch a movie by yourself. That's in part why I started the series, so I could write about movies that I love in a way that I hope would connect with you, the listener, and that we'd have a shared bond of enjoying some great entertainment. Anyway, enough of my own pitch, back to Godzilla vs. Kong. This is the fourth movie in Legendary's Monsterverse series, and like I said before, it's kind of weird to think that 7 years ago we saw Godzilla for the first time, and here it is on its fourth connected film. But what an epic ride it has been, right? I mean, look, don't worry, I will cover the other films in the Monsterverse, and maybe the Monsterverse itself one day, but for right now, let's talk about how this film came together and what got it made. It all goes back to the fall of 2015 when it was announced that Legendary had moved the production of Kong Skull Island from Universal to Warner Brothers. This further fueled speculation that the two monsters would fight one day. And 1 month later, in October 2015, that's exactly what happened. Legendary's Thomas Tull was able to negotiate the complicated rights for King Kong from Universal to his company, and then move it all back under the Warner Brothers banner. This actually does make the most amount of sense in regards to worldwide distribution, and I'm pretty sure that Universal got itself a nice piece of the pie. Now, after Legendary announced the film, one of its producers, Alex Garcia, speaking at a presentation in Japan, and who spoiled the entirety of Kong Skull Island for some reason, said that the idea was not to remake King Kong vs. Godzilla, the 1962 Japanese film. Now, if you don't know the premise of that movie, this is how IMDb explains it, and hold on to your butts. It says, a newspaper and television station funded by a pharmaceutical company wants a sensation, which happens to be the discovery of King Kong on an island. He is captured and brought to Japan, where he escapes from captivity and battles Godzilla. Trust me, the story of this half-century-old film is definitely interesting and will be in a future episode. But the big reason why Godzilla vs. Kong wasn't a remake is that originally the Japanese movie was made as more of a comedy. The Japanese filmmakers couldn't make King Kong scary because he was the protagonist, and the end result was something lighthearted and more satirical in nature. But much of that satire was lost in the American version because it needed to be more suitable for Western audiences. After that announcement, it took roughly another year and a half before Legendary announced that Adam Wingard had been tapped to direct. He was a bit of a controversial choice at the time. His adaptation of Death Note was right on the horizon, and a lot of hardcore Death Note fans were already hating on it because it wasn't a straightforward adaptation of the source material. The hatred for Wingard was actually there on social media, quite a bit actually. And if I recall correctly, it was about this time when he kind of backed off of social media entirely. Here's a true but odd side story. Adam and I used to be friends on Facebook, but I don't recall ever actually meeting him. But for a time, we were friends. I used to run a short film production website called Flash Your Shorts, and I believe this is where we met, just through emails. Honestly, I was always kind of scared to hit him up and ask for an interview. I do regret that now, because I would love to pick his brain over this movie and something like Blair Witch, and maybe one day that will happen. But like I said, there was a lot of social media backlash to him at first, and it's only gotten worse since the release of Death Note back in 2017. However, it's now been 4 years, and I do believe that most people have moved on. I guess it's a good thing his name isn't Ryan Johnson. However, to Wingard's credit, he's actually a good filmmaker, and one that was even chosen by Peter Jackson to helm a follow-up to King Kong from 2005. Wingard recently told the story to Slash Film, where he says that somehow Peter Jackson had seen an early copy of Adam's horror film You're Next, which was his somewhat breakout film, and Jackson was interested in Wingard directing the sequel to King Kong, which at the time was just going to be called Skull Island. And even though the project never moved forward with Wingard publicly, I mean, it was reported that Joe Cornish was a potential hire, and the same goes for Guillermo del Toro, but things worked out the way that they were supposed to for Adam. And he believes that this is in part due to a pre-existing relationship with Mary Parent, who now runs Legendary Pictures. Adam believes that the vote of confidence from Peter Jackson is what kept him in Mary's mind. In Hollywood, it is all about who you know, and if Peter freaking Jackson gives you a nod, you know it's going to work for someone. Now, when it came to the writing of this movie, Legendary wasn't messing around. They actually established a writer's room with Terry Rossio, who co-wrote Pirates of the Caribbean and Shrek, and even a draft of Godzilla 1998. Don't worry, it was one of the drafts that never got produced, by the way. The rest of the team was filled with relative unknowns like Patrick McKay, who according to IMDb got his first gig with being the showrunner for Amazon's The Lord of the Rings series. I mean, okay, good for him, but there's also JD Payne, who has the same credits on IMDb as Patrick McKay, and I'm not kidding on that either. No other screenwriting credits outside of Amazon's billion-dollar Lord of the Rings show exist for these guys, so that's kind of weird. The rest of the writer's room was a bit of a mishmash of people with varied or almost no credits to their name. But one person did stand out, and that was Jack Paglin. His two main credits are the 2014 Johnny Depp bomb Transcendence and Alien Covenant. But the really big name in the room was sci-fi guru J. Michael Straczynski. It isn't really known just who contributed what to the script, but Terry Rossio did talk about it with The Hollywood Reporter back in 2017 when the writer's room was first formed, and this is what he says. Godzilla vs. Kong was my first experience running a writer's room, and it was fantastic. It was a blast reading samples, meeting different writers, and crafting a story in a group setting. It felt similar to animation, where the film is happening up on the walls, and the end result is better than any one person could accomplish on their own. Now, having seen the movie, I'm not too sure how much of this I believe turned out the way that he wanted it to. Not to say that Godzilla vs. Kong is bad, far from it actually, but the script did feel underdeveloped to an extent, and that's odd considering that there were so many cooks in the kitchen. Hell, even Michael Dougherty, who co-wrote and directed Godzilla King of the Monsters, came in with his writing partner Zach Shields to provide rewrites and to make sure that certain themes from his film carried over into this one. Dougherty wanted Kong to connect with the humans because that had been a thing since the original film back in 1933, but for Godzilla, this would be more implied because we rarely ever get to see his softer side. In King of the Monsters, Godzilla is definitely the hero. In Godzilla vs. Kong, he's seen as an antagonist until the end. So that was really weird for me to see as a viewer. I mean, I would have liked to have spent more time with the softer side of Godzilla, considering how much I loved Godzilla King of the Monsters. Now, with the story developed and the character arcs in place, the script was then handed over to Eric Pearson and Max Borenstein to turn into something usable. Now, Eric Pearson had worked on Thor Ragnarok and Black Widow for Marvel, and Max Borenstein wrote Kong's Skull Island. This might explain why Kong was the main focus on Godzilla vs. Kong. Borenstein was clearly playing favorites, and I can't really fault him for that one either. If the idea is to create a relatable monster, he nailed it with Kong and Skull Island, and it only makes sense that this carries over into this movie. However, that sadly leaves Godzilla's arc in the dust, and I do think that did burn out quite a number of fans. And it kind of bummed me out if I'm being honest here. So, as the script itself was being written, the cast started getting fleshed out. Obviously, Millie Bobby Brown and Kyle Chandler were set to return, and so was Zhang Ziyi. But her scene was cut during editing. The same thing goes for Lance Reddick. His role in the movie was the director of Monarch, and he was supposed to have a much larger role. And this is what Adam Wingard had to say about that in an interview with Games Radar. He had a larger role, but ultimately we didn't need that scene. We changed a couple of plot details during the editing process, so that earlier stuff got cut. Now that stuff just counts as a fun cameo. He is still top credited, it's still part of his contract. It's funny because he shows up in the opening credits and then turns up for 4 lines, maybe 3, in the movie ultimately. See, I feel like this is a pretty big thing to omit in the final cut of the film. Monarch barely had any screen time in the movie at all, and it was a huge part of the previous 3 films. So to me, that was just like stupid weird, but I will talk more about that here in a bit. Eventually, Brian Tyree Henry, Demián Bichir, Alexander Skarsgård, Rebecca Hall, and Eiza González joined the cast, and production was ready to get underway. Funny enough, James Rolfe from Cinemassacre admitted that Adam Wingard offered him a cameo role in the movie, but he ultimately had to turn it down because of the birth of a second child, which, as a father of 2, I totally understand and can relate to. I mean, not that I almost missed the birth of my second daughter because I was going to be in a movie. That was actually because of bad cell service, but that's a totally different and unrelated story. Now, principal photography for Godzilla vs. Kong began on November 12, 2018, and lasted through April 2019. They shot the film in Australia and Hawaii mostly, with a brief stop in Hong Kong. After that, they went into post-production in hopes of making that 2020 release date that had been previously announced. This, of course, was before the COVID-19 outbreak, which ultimately pushed the film to March 2021, but during the downtime, they were able to re-edit the movie, and they were able to get Junkie XL on board as the composer. The story for how Junkie XL got the gig for this movie goes all the way back to 2018, when he first met with Adam Wingard and confessed to being a huge Godzilla fan. In fact, he even composed theme music for the King of the Monsters in his own spare time. From there, he began tweaking his material and sharing it with Wingard, who, according to Junkie XL, was totally in love with it. And from there, it was announced in June 2020 that Hulkenborg would be composing the score for all of Godzilla vs. Kong. And as much as I love Junkie XL's music in the movie, I kind of miss the more melodic approach that Bear McCreary did with King of the Monsters. I get that the 2 films are tonally different and require a different approach to the score, but this is just something I picked up on. Kind of like with the human element of the movie being so dramatically reduced, it feels like there's something missing. And even though what we have is great, there's always that thought of what could be. You know what I mean? Anyway, as I mentioned before, COVID-19 really kept this movie from hitting theaters in 2020. In fact, it was originally planned for a March 13th, 2020 release, then it was delayed till May 22nd, and then again to May 29th, and then pushed all the way back to November 2020. But as those dates came closer and closer, Warner Brothers decided to push it all the way back to May 21st, 2021. Warner Brothers really wanted this movie to go to theatrical because in February 2020, they held test screenings that received mostly positive responses. And looking at the response to the film now, I can totally see why they would get those results. My own little tinfoil for what comes next is I think word of mouth of this made its way to Netflix because in November 2020, The Hollywood Reporter said that the film was being eyed for a streaming release and that Netflix offered upwards of $250 million to secure the rights. However, Warner Media blocked this because they had HBO Max and they needed content for it. Originally, Warner Brothers stood firm on the theatrical release date, but Jason Kilar, Warner Media CEO, and Warner Media Studio CEO Ann Sarnoff did consider the simultaneous release of the film because that is what they were doing with Wonder Woman 1984. And after that movie came out on HBO Max and brought in a lot of new people to the service, it was announced that all films from 2021 would be releasing in theaters and on HBO Max for 1 month. This, of course, actually pissed off Legendary Pictures because, they're the financiers of the film, and they clearly wanted a return on their investment, but they were also not given any advance notice of this decision. This was clearly it's better to ask forgiveness than permission moment, but it definitely speaks to Warner Brothers as a company as of late. Yeah, I'm pretty critical of them recently because of the way that they've been acting, and this is just another reason to back that up. However, not long after this kerfuffle, both parties figured out a plan to keep the day and date release on track. Because HBO Max isn't available worldwide just yet, the film actually did open a week early in some international markets and did pretty well. In China, where the film was only estimated to gross about $50 million, it pulled in a whopping $123 million in its first weekend. It did pretty well in the United States as well. During the domestic opening, it was able to gross $23 million, and a lot of this did come from positive word of mouth. If I'm being honest, I believe that there are a couple mitigating factors here. The key one is that the movie is a big summer blockbuster that actually decided to release in theaters. It's pure escapism, just like the original King Kong was escapism during the Great Depression. And the second reason really is that positive word of mouth is a pretty big factor. So far, people really seem to like this movie because it delivers on exactly what it promised: big monster action. This movie has tons of it, and it's beautiful to look at too. Now, on Rotten Tomatoes, the movie is currently sitting at a 76% fresh rating, where the general critical consensus is this: delivering squarely on its title, Godzilla vs. Kong swats away character development and human drama to deliver all the spectacle you'd expect from giant monsters slugging it out. This is like the key takeaway from all of this. The lack of human characters is a big factor in the follow-up discussion of this movie. One of the bigger complaints about King of the Monsters and even 2014's Godzilla is that no one really cared about the human characters, and many people asked why they were there in the first place. Or in the case of 2014's Godzilla, why they marketed it as Bryan Cranston being in the movie when he died very quickly. But human characters are always needed to ground the film for the audience. We need someone to relate to. In Godzilla vs. Kong, we didn't really have that. And that was something that was noticed by some critics. Alonso Duralde from The Wrap summed it up best by saying this. He says, "Obviously, no one goes to these movies for the deep human characters or for plot machinations or even the metaphors about the environment and industrialization. Here's the thing though, they come in handy to fill the gaps between the monster battles, and you miss them when they're not there. And since even those battles are somewhat perfunctory, what are we even doing here?" And he's right. The movie is fast-paced. It comes in with a brisk runtime of 113 minutes, which leads me to believe that there is much they left on the cutting room floor in regards to the quote-unquote human element. But when asked about the final cut of the movie, this is what Adam Wingard had to say. He says, "This is the ultimate version of the film. We actually did the least amount of reshoots than any of those Monsterverse films. Normally they do about 2 weeks, but we only did 5 days. We had to be quite surgical, as we did change one element of the plot and it affected a couple of scenes at the beginning and a couple of scenes at the end. That's where my low budget, no budget background comes in. You have to be very crafty and to think in those terms. We were very surgical in those terms. So no, this is the ultimate version of the film. I would never do any other version of it." Look, to be honest, we've heard those comments before. David Ayer said the same thing about the theatrical cut of Suicide Squad from 2016, and we all know now that he was lying and that he has a cut of the movie that fans are begging Warner Brothers to see. Look, personally, as much as I like the film, I would like to see a longer version of it. I do want to connect with the human characters, but I feel very much the same way about them that I did with the humans from Bumblebee. Underdeveloped and largely useless. As for the future of the Monsterverse, I kind of think this is it for the time being. The deal that Legendary had with Toho for the rights to Godzilla expired in 2020, and unless this film absolutely delivers financially, which in a pandemic it actually seems to be doing alright, then who knows if we'll ever get to go back to this world. Wingard has an idea for where things could go, but even he says that it's at a crossroads and that the fans have to step forward and vote for more of these things, which is true. So if you want to see more of the Monsterverse world, you gotta nut up or shut up. You gotta vote with your wallet. And right now that might be tough, but that's where it's at. At the end of the day, I really did enjoy Godzilla vs. Kong. It was a nice entry and almost a culmination of the Monsterverse. I would love to see more out of this world with a better fleshed out plot and better fleshed out characters. There's a lot there that's really cool, and I really am happy that we got these movies because it felt very touch and go for a while. But as always, I do want to hear what you guys have to say about this. If you liked this Podio commentary episode, please, wherever you can, leave a like, leave a comment. If it's on YouTube, subscribe to the channel. If it's on iTunes, subscribe to the podcast. And of course, I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you very much for listening. Have yourself a great day, and peace out.